This place was once a Jewish or Jewish-Christian settlement and therefore adds some evidence to the belief that Jesus did in fact pass through here and possibly performed this miracle.
Stuff includes the Greek New Testament. And it was from one of these masks that we recovered a fragment of the Gospel of Mark that is dated to the 80s.
Symbol believed to be the most iconic identification of the resurrection were recently revealed on an ossuary.
A Hebrew marble slab, an antique piece of marble, was dug up in Kersey.
The Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Romans, Chapter 1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he had promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son Jesus Christ our Lord, which was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead, by whom we have received grace and apostleship, for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name, among whom are ye also the called of Jesus Christ. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.
Easter egg hunt up in Central Park today. Thousands of children, many of them dressed as bunnies, looking for the eggs and chocolate all over the mountain, chocolate bunnies. Tell me, how many do you believe of those children know anything about Jesus, about his death, his resurrection, and his ascension to glory? How many of those children know anything about it at all? They can tell you all about Santa Claus, they can tell you about the bunny, and they can tell you about all of their cartoon characters, and they can't tell you one word about Jesus Christ. Nothing about his resurrection.
Archaeologists have found a tablet with Hebrew letters engraved on it at the speculated site of Jesus' miracle of swine. Now, the discovery of the 1,500-year-old marble tablet at the Sea of Galilee, engraved with significant Aramaic words written in Hebrew letters, suggests that this place was once a Jewish or Jewish Christian settlement, and therefore adds some evidence to the belief that Jesus did in fact pass through here and possibly performed this miracle. So this tablet is 59 inches long. It's found at Curzy, which is the site that the folklore has it that Jesus performed this miracle of swine. Little reminder of what that is about. He was apparently healing a man of the legion of demons that had possessed this man. On the eastern shore of Galilee, Jesus drove the demons into a large herd of pigs. So he removed the man's demonic possession, put it in the pigs, and then led the pigs off the steep bank to drown in the Sea of Galilee. So this is sort of ancient folklore, but they've now found this tablet with 8 lines of Hebrew writing. They've managed to identify 2 words so far. The 2 words are Amen and Maria, which they say probably refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus, or it could just refer to the word marble, but they think it refers to Mary. I just want to read you a little quote from the researcher Michael Artsy of the University of Haifa's Institute for Maritime Studies. He said, "This discovery bolsters the belief, which was until now considered folklore, that this is the settlement of Curzy, which Jesus visited, and where he performed the miracle of swine."
What is so unique about Jesus Christ? Because my Muslim friend would say, well, Muhammad is equal to Jesus. And why are you convinced in the case for Christ?
I'm convinced, first of all, because Jesus made a startling claim. He claimed that he's the Son of God. That's clear from history. He made that assertion. Now, anybody can claim that. When I was a reporter, we did a lot of investigative stories about mental hospitals. And I want to tell you, there's no shortage of people who will tell you they're God. And they're clearly not. But why is it that people around the planet have believed Jesus? The question is, do you have any evidence to back up your claim? And what we have is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He didn't just say I'm the Son of God, but we have convincing evidence. We have evidence, I taught the 5 E's real quick to summarize the evidence of the resurrection. The execution of Jesus. He was clearly dead when he was taken off the cross. I mean, even the Journal of the American Medical Association did an article analyzing the historical medical data. It said clearly he was dead even before the spear was thrust into his side. Secondly, we have the empty tomb. Everybody in the ancient world agreed the tomb of Jesus was empty on that first Easter morning. The question was, how did it get empty? And of course, the religious authorities made up the story that the disciples had somehow stolen the body. Well, they didn't have the means or the motive or the opportunity. So that clearly isn't the answer. But the tomb was clearly empty. Third, we have eyewitnesses. Over 515 eyewitnesses, including skeptics, whose lives were transformed because they encountered the resurrected Jesus. In a lot of different circumstances. They touched him, they ate with him, they communicated with him. This is not a legend, not a hallucination, not wishful thinking. This was reality. And then we have early records. And this is so important, I think, when we look at the difference between Islam and Christianity. And I have a dear Muslim friend who comes over to my house and we grill steaks and we talk about this. And, the point I tried to make to him is I said, this is not, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. We have all these things so far, the execution, the empty tomb, and the eyewitnesses so far. But we also have early records of all of this. And why that's important is, I used to think this idea that Jesus is the Son of God who rose from the dead was a legend that grew up in the many centuries later. But what we have preserved for us is a creed of the early church that summarizes the essence of Christianity. The Apostle Paul reports it in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and following. This creed says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. He was resurrected on the 3rd day. And then it mentions the names of specific eyewitnesses, including skeptics, who encountered him and were willing to die for their conviction that he returned from the dead and proved he's the Son of God. Now, this creed has been dated back by scholars from a wide range of theological belief to as early as 24 to 36 months after the life of Jesus, and the beliefs that make up that creed go right back to the cross itself. So this is like a news flash from ancient history. This is reliable historical data. Now, I said to my Muslim friend, I said, I have this data, Not just those E's, I'll give you one more real quick, the emergence of the church. How do you explain the sudden explosion of the Christian church onto the scene in the very same city where Jesus was put to this humiliating, degrading death just a few weeks later? How do you explain that apart from the resurrection? Because we have records of Peter getting up to this group and saying, men of Israel, listen to these words. This Jesus, you remember him, he did miracles in your midst. You know that he did. And then he said, God raised him from the dead, to which we're all witnesses. And what did they say? Did they say, Peter, you're out of your mind. You don't know what you're talking about. No. 3,000 of them said, Peter, we know you're telling the truth. We know these things are true. What do we do? And they found repentance and faith in Jesus Christ. The church was born. 3,000 people that day. How do you explain that if the resurrection isn't true? So I said to my Muslim friend, I said, I've got all this historical data, fresh, right back to the scene. And then I have Muhammad, who over 600 years later says he is told by an angel in a cave that Jesus did not die on the cross. There was no resurrection. Look at, I've read the Quran, Surah 4, verse 157. It says Jesus didn't die on the cross. And also the Quran is very clear. It says God did not have a son. So I say, okay, just from an historical analysis perspective, if I have this really reliable historical data for the resurrection, and then I've got someone 600 years later saying it's not true, where does the evidence most logically point in terms of something that I can put my trust in? So we've had a lot of debates about this kind of thing, and I think it's healthy to engage in these kind of dialogues with people because, I think as Christians, we have an unfair advantage in the marketplace of spiritual ideas. And that unfair advantage, if I can be frank, is the truth is on our side. And so we ought to be able to say, you know what? Peter tells us in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have.
I don't know what, because it hasn't received a number yet. Will it be P128, 129? I don't know. It'll be published later this year. And where did we find it? Well, we dug underneath somebody's face, and there it was. That's a mummy mask that you're looking at. Let me explain what's going on here. This is very exciting. Mummy masks, if you were the pharaoh, were made out of pure gold. If you were a wealthy person, it would be neatly carved and perhaps then covered with gold leaf and a few jewels. But if you weren't really wealthy, and if you were just, say middle class, you could afford a sarcophagus for the body of your loved one, but the mummy mask that covered the face would be made out of paper mache. Did you know paper mache dates back that far? At least 3,000 years. Now, paper was expensive, as I already said. So you don't take brand new papyrus, no matter how much you love grandma, and make a paper mache mask out of brand new paper. You used paper. And that's the best kind if you're a scholar, because we want to find old paper with writing on it, not old blank paper. Paper that's been used, paper that's been written. And of course, if you're a pagan and you have no respect for the Christians, then you use their writings as trash and you make paper mache masks out of their stuff. And their stuff includes the Greek New Testament. And it was from one of these masks that we recovered a fragment of the Gospel of Mark that is dated to the 80s. We could have a first century fragment of Mark for the first time ever. The more we find, we keep inching our way. Just imagine Gary Habermas now. We keep inching our way toward ground zero. The autographs. This is really amazing. We knew that was a possibility. There are hundreds of these low-end paper mache masks that have been painted. But the trick was to get the mask to dissolve so that we could pull apart the papyrus without losing the ink on the papyrus. That would defeat the whole purpose. And some genius came up with a solution that allows the glue to dissolve and the papyrus paper to come loose into pieces that could then be picked out of this little bath, and the ink is still on the papyrus and still legible. We've recovered 2 second century papyri. That's why I'm not certain of the numbering here. And a papyrus fragment of Mark dating to the 80s, and other Christian sermons and letters and other things, as well as lots of secular stuff. And so the work will continue. This is very exciting.
outside these doors, this whole society is about Jesus. New York City is totally ignorant of anything about Christ and His resurrection. No, Satan has succeeded in producing this generation. No, we don't have prayer in school anymore, but we've got violence, we've got mass murder, we've got kids running around with box cutters slashing each other. We've pushed the gospel out, we've done all of that. Now we have an educational system that is known to be the poorest in the world. No, we don't have Bibles anymore, we don't have prayer, but we have got kids that are out of control, we have teachers being beaten. Now, why is this society suddenly gone mad? I mean, it is just spinning into a crisis of chaos. And what is the reason? Why such sudden violence, especially in our schools? Why are so many people just absolutely giving themselves over to lust and filth? Because there's no hope. They have absolutely been robbed of all hope. Paul said that even a Christian could be robbed of his hope. His life would be miserable if he didn't believe there was a resurrection. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we would be most miserable, Paul said. Even a Christian, if all you knew that Jesus died, he was crucified and he died and he wasn't raised again, that would have been the end.
Mine was mostly a heart issue. I wanted to know that God was real, and the way that was real for me was experientially. And for Lee, it was more about documentation, about being able to have facts that proved it true.
Well, I was a journalist, so there was really no problem with me picking up the phone and calling a scholar and saying, hey, I'm Lee Strobel, I'm with the Chicago Tribune. I'd like some background information about the New Testament. And so I would do that, and I thought it was going to be so easy to expose the fallacious thinking behind Christianity. But as it turned out, it took me almost 2 years of my life to investigate these issues. It really was, in a sense, the most exciting story I'd ever pursued as a journalist. Well, I began my investigation by looking at the gospel accounts. How did I know that the New Testament was telling me the truth when it talked about Jesus? Now, obviously, I didn't accept the New Testament as being the inspired Word of God. I certainly didn't accept it as being inerrant. But what I had to accept it as being, which it undeniably is a set of ancient historical documents. And I knew that historians had criteria that they could apply to determine whether or not these documents are trustworthy. So those are the kind of people who I pursued. I went after the heavy hitters. I went after the expert witnesses who could help me sort through these issues.
J.P. Moreland, Biola University. Mark Strauss, Bethel Seminary. Craig Blomberg, Denver Seminary. Craig Evans, Acadia Divinity College. N.T. Wright, Bishop of Durham, United Kingdom.
Over the last 250 years, it's been common coin in Western culture that, oh, you can't believe what's said in the Gospels. You know, it's even made into musicals. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. And that skepticism has wormed its way into much modern culture, and indeed into many Christian circles, many church circles, where they'll say, well, Matthew probably made this bit up, or Luke just added this bit on the end of the parable, or whatever it is. I and others have spent some of the best years of our lives researching what was actually going on in Palestine in the first third of the 1st century AD, and trying to get inside the minds of 1st century Jews, 1st century Romans, different Jewish parties and movements, etc., etc. And the more that I have tried to do that, the more I've found that what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes up in 3 dimensions and says, my goodness, this actually belongs. It makes sense. It fits. It gives us very vivid portraits of who these people were and what they were doing.
The New Testament Gospels are biographies of Jesus. While the authors do not identify themselves in the text, from very early in the Christian era, the Gospels have been attributed to Matthew, a disciple or follower of Jesus; Mark, a colleague of Peter, also a disciple; Luke, a historian and confidant of the Apostle Paul; and John, a disciple of Jesus. Both Matthew and John were among the 12, Jesus' closest followers and constant companions throughout his ministry. They would have personally observed most of the events they described in their Gospels. Mark and Luke were also contemporaries of Jesus and wrote their biographies based upon information provided by many eyewitnesses.
With what you have now. Folks, life is miserable for most people in this world, and all they have is misery. The only way I see to prove the resurrection to this blinded, wicked generation is by sight and not by faith. You and I receive it by faith, they cannot. Paul said they don't need a written epistle. The Bible says very clearly they could not understand what is written or preached. Paul said they're only going to understand the resurrection as you prove it.
Let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed. However, if you're going to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus walked on water, that he turned water into wine, that is palpably anti-scientific. There is no evidence for that. And if there were, you would be, well, I mean, no, there simply isn't any evidence for that, and no scientist could possibly take the idea seriously.
I can make it worse for you.
I know you can.
Because Jesus actually claimed to be the Logos that created the whole universe. And if this is the Creator incarnate, making water into wine and so on is really a triviality. The more fundamental thing is the fact that he claimed to be and gave evidence that he was God. When you say it's anti-scientific, I don't think it's anti-scientific at all. Science cannot say that miracles do not occur. It can say they're highly improbable. But nobody is claiming that these things occurred by natural processes. They occurred because God fed his power in. Nor did the whole universe, if we look at it, occur in that sense by natural processes. God created it. We study all the natural processes within it. So when you say it's anti-scientific, I think it's not anti-scientific.
What I mean by that is that if and when doing science, we constantly have to keep in mind that at any moment there might be a little magic trick slipped in. That would completely nullify the whole enterprise of science.
Oh, I agree with that. But
well,
you see,
that's what you're allowing.
No, I'm not allowing that at all, because in order to recognize what the New Testament calls miracle, a special act of God, you must be living in a universe that has regularities and that we recognize them. I agree with you entirely.
Otherwise you wouldn't notice the miracles.
That's exactly true. Yeah. You wouldn't recognize if dead people were popping up all over the place. You wouldn't think it was very special. But the fact is you need two things, not one. You've got to have regularities which we call the laws of nature, although they're not causes. They're in a sense descriptions that we can use. You also need to be able to recognize those so that, for example, when Joseph discovered that his wife-to-be Mary was pregnant, he simply didn't believe her story. He was going to divorce her. He knew exactly where babies came from. He knew the regularity. It took very special convincing for him to realize that something extremely special had happened. But science cannot stop that. The question is, of course, did such a thing ever happen? And the central focus in the New Testament is not that, which is not so readily accessible to evidence, the virgin conception, but the resurrection of Christ. And ancient historians, and this has fascinated me recently going over it, ancient historians whose discipline is very venerable, and I'm not talking about Christian ancient historians, ancient historians, many of them, even at the skeptical end of the spectrum, say that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ is very powerful. The explosion of the Christian church from a non-proselytizing group of Jews in the first century, the empty tomb and all the rest of it, has even led Geza Vermesh, who's one of the most distinguished ancient historians in Oxford, To say, yes, this tomb was empty, and hallucinations and this kind of explanation do not wash. So we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to believe in historical testimony or not?
We have seen the Lord. Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. Peace be unto you. Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands. And reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. Be not faithless, but believing. My Lord and my God. Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed.
I would like to present you a case for the historical existence of Jesus. Lately, there have been many people who have been claiming that there is no evidence to verify his actual existence. It has become so widely claimed by recent speakers that most of us take for granted what we have been told, although it is rare to find anyone who has actually looked for themselves to verify this claim. First, you should know that this view is a new one. All throughout history, skeptics used to claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or that his miracles were only parlor tricks, or that the disciples stole his body from the tomb, but they never claimed he didn't exist. Claiming that he never existed only became possible recently due to the long period of time that has passed since the 1st century. In actuality, there is much more evidence for Jesus' existence than there is for almost any important or famous person of that time. In this presentation, we will be using only non-biblical evidence. In other words, we won't be using the Bible to prove the Bible. We will also be stopping after every account to address the typical skeptical questions about each claim. I warn you though, if you watch this video, you will no longer be able to believe that there is no evidence for the existence of Jesus, and you might even start to question the integrity of the research of those that have told you that there isn't. I will be quoting from a website called thedivineevidence.com, and I will link it in the description section of this video. Cornelius Tacitus lived from 55 to 120 AD. Tacitus was a 1st and 2nd century Roman historian who lived through the reigns of over half a dozen Roman emperors. Considered one of the greatest historians of Rome, Tacitus verifies the biblical account of Jesus' execution at the hands of Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from 26 to 36 AD during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus writes the following: Christus, the founder of the Christian name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. It would confirm the following: that Jesus did exist, that he was the founder of Christianity, that Jesus was put to death by Pilate, that Christianity originated in Judea with Jesus, and that Christianity later spread to Rome. Skeptic Interjection 1. Could Tacitus have taken his information from Christian sources? Answer. Because of his position as a professional historian and not as a commentator, it is more likely that Tacitus referenced government records over Christian testimony. It is also possible Tacitus received some of his information from his friend and fellow secular historian Pliny the Younger. Yet, even if Tacitus referenced some of Pliny's sources, it would be out of his character to have done so without critical investigation. An example of Tacitus criticizing testimony given to him even from his dear friend Pliny is found here in Annals 55. Tacitus distinguishes between confirmed and hearsay accounts almost 70 times in his History. If he felt this account of Jesus was only rumor or folklore, he would have issued his usual disclaimer that this account was unverified, but he did not. Skeptic Interjection 2. Could this passage have been a Christian interpolation or forgery? Answer. Judging by the critical undertones of this passage, it is highly unlikely. Tacitus refers to Christianity as a superstition and an insuppressible mischief. Furthermore, there is not a surviving copy of Tacitus's Annals that does not contain this passage. There is no verifiable evidence of tampering of any kind in this passage. Skeptic Interjection 3. Why is this passage not quoted by the early church fathers? Answer. Due to the condescending nature of Tacitus's testimony, early Christian authors most likely would not have quoted such a source, assuming Tacitus's writings were even available to them. However, our actual answer comes from the context of the passage itself. Nothing in Tacitus's statement mentions anything that was not already common knowledge among Christians. It simply provides evidence of Jesus' existence, which is a topic not debated at this point in history. Let's move on to Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist and rhetorician who scornfully describes his views of early Christianity. Though he ridicules the Christians and their Christ, his writings confirm Jesus was executed via crucifixion and that he was the founder of Christianity. He says, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship their crucified sage, and live after his laws." What this passage reveals and how it confirms the biblical account. 1. That Jesus did exist. 2. That Jesus was the founder of Christianity. 3. Jesus was worshipped by his followers. And 4. That Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. Skeptic Interjection 1. Can we consider Lucian's testimony reliable, due to the source being a literary work? Answer. Lucian's comments revolved around historical events. In Lucian's work, The Way to Write History, he openly criticizes his contemporaries, who distort history to flatter their masters or those who fill in historical gaps with their personal conjecture. He writes, "The historian's one task is to tell the thing as it happened. He may nurse some private dislikes, but he will attach far more importance to the public good and set the truth high above his hate. For history, I say again, has this and only this for its own. If a man will start upon it, he must sacrifice to no God but truth. He must neglect all else." Skeptic Interjection 2. Is it possible Lucian received his knowledge from Christian sources, or that this passage is an interpolation or forgery? Answer. Seeing how adamant Lucian was in regards to historical accuracy and critical investigation, our answer is an emphatic no. As to the passage being a Christian forgery, chances are that the reference to Jesus would be far more favorable if this were so. Lucian refers to Jesus only as a man, a lawgiver, and a sage. Human, not divine descriptions. He never once refers to Jesus as a god. Furthermore, there isn't anything in the above statement that reveals what wasn't already known. It merely asserts that Jesus lived, preached, and died. Remember, at this time, Christians were trying to prove Jesus' divinity, not his existence. Next, we're going to look at Flavius Josephus. And before we get started on the details of Josephus, I'd like to make a personal comment. And that is that I've heard for a very long time that this Josephus quote was an obvious forgery. But if you look into it, you'll find that there are really only two different versions of this particular account of Josephus's talking about Jesus. He actually talks about Jesus in another account that's not disputed, but this particular one is. And what you'll find is that there's really two versions, and they don't really differ in anything important. At least when we're arguing Jesus' existence, because they both admit that he existed, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that he had many followers, both Jews and Gentiles, and that he performed what Josephus calls wonderful works. I think one reason that this particular passage of Josephus has been singled out for accusations and even misinformation is that it's a very good account from a very prominent historian who lived at that time and would have probably interviewed the apostles themselves. All of that being said, there is a lot to debate and to talk about this particular passage and the other passage that Josephus mentions Jesus in. So let's look into it. This is what was written. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribes of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. This is what the other version reads. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. And the tribes of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day.
I love
can
it.
tell.
Yeah. So, yeah, kind of obvious, can't hide it. But actually, my question comes from one of my teammates. I get into a lot of theological debates because, as you know, that's a community that doesn't really have a lot of religious background in it. It's all very intellectual and not really seated. And so he was talking to me a little bit about Christianity. And he asked me the question, where is there proof outside of the Bible that Jesus existed, the history of Christ and who he was? And I said there were writings out there, but I wasn't really sure what they were, so if you could.
That's a good question, but it's also somewhat wrong-headed. Wow, I sounded like a politician there for a moment, or I sounded like a boss giving a report. Anyway, it is a good question, but it is somewhat wrong-headed because the Bible is not one book. You've got 39 Old Testament, perhaps more if you're Catholic. You've got 27 New Testament. And, you know, so to treat it all as if it were just unallowable evidence is kind of short-sighted, because the people who were not Christian, were not followers of Jesus, the moment they believed him to be risen, they became followers of Jesus, like Paul. And so if you're going to cut out everyone like that's testimony, that's everyone who has one position, even though they're coming from all these different backgrounds. So that's the first thing I would say. It's not quite a fair way to treat the evidence. But there is plenty of evidence outside of the New Testament. For more on this, go to the work of Gary Habermas. He has a book called Historical Jesus. I believe it's free on his website, garyhabermas.com. But he lists all the extra-biblical records of Jesus in the New Testament. Outside of the New Testament. So, for example, Pliny the Elder, right? Pliny's writing a letter to Trajan. It's in book 10 of his epistles, and as he's writing a letter to them, he says to Trajan, basically he says, look, I've got all these Christians. I've been asking them what they do, and they just tell me that they're trying to be good and helping people, but I don't believe them, so I've been killing them. Emperor Trajan, tell me how I'm supposed to do this. Should I be seeking them out and killing them? Or should I wait till they come to me? Maybe someone brings them to me. What should I do? In the process of writing this letter, he says that Jesus is worshipped as a god very early on. In other letters, we see things, for example, Lucian of Samosata, we see that in the Talmud, which is a Jewish source, we see in Mara bar Serapion, we see in Tacitus. These are all non-Christian, non-New Testament sources. All of them say Jesus was killed by crucifixion. So that is why scholars like Bart Ehrman, who I mentioned before, like Paula Fredrickson, like Marcus Borg, who I believe recently passed away, all these scholars who are non-Christian can say we can be certain that Jesus Christ died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Paula Fredrickson even says that this is one of the most certain facts of history. Not just as certain regarding Jesus, it's one of the most certain facts of history because these records are so widespread from so many different people. Not just Christians in the first generation in the New Testament, also Christians outside of the New Testament from the first generation. So read a letter like 1 Clement, which is Christian but not in the New Testament. From people who are Gentiles, like Tacitus and Lucian. From people who are Jews, like Talmud and Mara Bar Serapion. You've got a lot of this stuff everywhere. But I would be very remiss if I said that you can just toss out the New Testament. It's really not the right way to do history.
From my years as a legal journalist, the importance of eyewitness testimony. In fact, the first question that anybody asks is, how many eyeballs are there? How many eyewitnesses do you actually have? And I needed to determine whether or not contemporary scholars have ascertained whether or not the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony.
It's become evident to scholars of the first century that the Gospels were actually attempts to write biographies of Jesus. Now, not in the modern sense, because the Gospels are not particularly interested in his early years. But when it comes to Jesus' adult life and his activities, these are biographies. They're very clearly attempts by eyewitnesses to describe exactly what Jesus said and did, and the consensus of New Testament scholarship has moved in that direction.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2.
Luke's gospel begins with a prologue. It's actually one of the finest Greek sections in the whole New Testament. Luke was clearly a literary artist. But in that prologue, he points out that he has carefully investigated the material that he presents in the Gospels, that he's checked with eyewitness accounts, those who are actually present. If you read that prologue and you see this is the work of a historian, this was someone who has done his research.
Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke chapter 1, verses 3 and 4.
You have to understand that people in the first century valued eyewitness testimony. And this is why, from the 2nd century on, it was important to the early church fathers that the people who were alleged to have written the Gospels actually wrote them, and that they were eyewitnesses of the things they wrote.
We have actually very early attestation of the authorship of the Gospels. The early church father Papias, for example, as recorded by the church historian Eusebius, identifies Mark's Gospel as essentially the eyewitness account of Peter. Well, Papias was a disciple of the Apostle John, so we are only one generation removed from Jesus himself. That's a pretty close testimony, and strongly suggesting that, in fact, the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts.
Now, of course, it's not what you would have seen if you had a video camera there, because, after all, if you put a video camera on a street corner, even in Washington, you'd get politicians coming to and fro. You wouldn't actually have a story that would make sense. You'd have a string of random, unsorted events. That doesn't mean that none of it happened, that it's all made up. It's just to acknowledge what is blindingly obvious, that it has been edited and no doubt shaped by the needs of the community, because people tell the sort of stories that they want to tell, because this matters to us urgently here and now.
It is being heralded as the greatest archaeological find of all time, the first physical evidence of the existence of Jesus. This simple limestone box with its ancient Aramaic inscription is believed to be the 2,000-year-old ossuary or bone box of the brother of Jesus of Nazareth.
What it says is Yaakov or Jacob or James in its anglicized form, Bar, son of, Yosef or Joseph, Achiu de, the brother of, Yeshua, Jesus. James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And it's that inscription that has captivated the imagination of the world.
When the news of the James ossuary broke in the autumn of 2002, the ancient artifact very rapidly became the focus of international interest and debate. Where did it come from? Was James really the brother of Jesus? And the biggest question of all, is the bone box genuine or is it in fact a fraud? Two-time Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker Simcha Jakubowicz landed the world exclusive to the story. Although, to date, most of his films have focused on Jewish themes, Jakubowicz, an Orthodox Jew, found the topic fascinating.
As somebody interested in history, I was, blown away, because suddenly you had an artifact that the whole world was saying, wow, could this really be it? So I was immediately drawn. As a filmmaker, I was very privileged to have something that the whole world wanted, and I had unique access. We were able to bring our cameras behind the scenes and take viewers behind the scenes in an exclusive way.
Jakubowicz's well-paced investigative documentary entitled James, Brother of Jesus, answers the question of the authenticity of the find.
I give time to everybody, the people who say it's a forgery and the people who say it's authentic. But I think that at the end of the day, people who watch the film will be convinced, as I was making it, that this thing is the real thing, that has been authenticated by every test that modern science can throw at it.
For the first time, the world would get a chance to view the James ossuary right here in Toronto in the building directly behind me, the Royal Ontario Museum. But its journey to Toronto was not without incident. Damaged en route from Israel, the ancient priceless artifact was cracked in a number of places. Once restored, however, the James ossuary would draw record-breaking numbers to the Royal Ontario Museum.
If this is real, then this is the find of the millennium, maybe the 2 millennia, because this is an artifact that overarches all the artifacts. This is not someone's tongue, ear, finger, head, ankle, whatever, vertebrae. This is an inscription saying Jesus existed in the 1st century.
Public ministry began with the choosing of his disciples and lasted approximately 3 years, culminating in the Passion Week and his trial and death. Scholars generally agree that the Gospel of Mark was written first, sometime between the years 60 and 75 in the 1st century. Matthew and Luke were probably authored shortly after, followed by the Gospel of John.
The New Testament Gospels are by far our earliest and most reliable records of Jesus of Nazareth. All of the New Testament Gospels were written in the 1st century. Not only are they remarkably close to the events themselves, but in fact, eyewitnesses are still around. If they were passing on untruths, if they were not passing on reliable history, then we would expect eyewitnesses to say, wait a minute, this isn't what happened. But eyewitnesses are around. Eyewitnesses could confirm what they said. All of the gospel writers either were eyewitnesses or interviewed eyewitnesses to gain the information that they gained about Jesus Christ.
As I scrutinized the gospel accounts even further, I realized that it was important to find out not just whether or not the information was rooted in direct and indirect eyewitness testimony, but I needed to know, was this information reliably preserved during the time period before it was finally written down?
We have to put ourselves into the ancient world without modern media, without even a print-based culture in which the only and the standard way of preserving information was through oral tradition, most of which was memorized.
Young rabbis were often forbidden to comment on a passage of Scripture until they had memorized it perfectly. In fact, it was not uncommon for rabbis of Jesus' time to commit the entire Torah to memory.
I've sometimes heard people say, look, I've been in a situation where I whisper something to someone, they whisper it to someone else, and it goes through 10 or 11 people, and by the time the last person tells what was said, it's totally different from what I told the first person. And we can't trust the Gospels for the same reason, because it was transmitted over a long period of time. That illustration is really a bad analogy, and you have to understand that the first century apostles who passed on information about Jesus were deeply concerned to get this information correct, because they saw it as sacred holy tradition. It wasn't about what Joe was eating for dinner last Wednesday night.
In our day of instant media and everything has to be on film or tape recorded, we are more skeptical of oral tradition, but we don't really understand the nature of oral tradition. Oral tradition is a community event. A story is passed down by individuals within that community. Well, if they get it wrong, you've got an entire community that's going to correct them. So it is self-correcting all the way. These stories were passed on reliably because they were passed on by the community of disciples.
In fact, we now have scholarly studies that have been done of oral cultures, and we know that through several generations, oral tradition can be preserved and passed on without changing a thing.
Even though I became convinced that ancient cultures could pass along oral tradition reliably over time, I still had an obvious objection to the New Testament, and that was, isn't it really filled with contradictions?
One of the issues people often raise is the question of apparent contradictions between the Synoptic Gospels, where there's a parallel story. For example, Matthew tells the story of 2 blind men being healed, whereas in Mark's account there's only 1 blind man. How can we get this contradiction? The vast majority of these apparent contradictions, however, are quite easily resolved. Mark describes only one of the 2 blind men, the one who is most prominent, obviously, or perhaps even the one who became a disciple of Jesus and became prominent in the later church. So most of these apparent contradictions are quite easily resolved.
Had every single account given us exactly the same detail, we might have accused them of some form of collusion, of having gotten together and carefully planned out how they were always going to tell the story with the exact number of details, but then one doesn't have independent testimony at all.
It's natural when you have multiple eyewitnesses to the same event. You're going to get different perspectives, and that's okay. You want that. What you're looking for is a core to the testimony that's the same, that's consistent, even though there may be some variation in the incidental details. If you're in a court of law and you have multiple witnesses come in and testify to the exact same thing, the first objection that's brought up is to say collusion. They got together. They orchestrated their testimony, and their credibility is shot.
Glorify God in the day of visitation. This is from 1 Peter, 2nd chapter. When Peter goes on, he's talking to wives with unsaved husbands. And he's saying, they may also, without the word, be won by your behavior, by the behavior of the wife, or the conversation of the wife, while they behold, and in the Greek, inspect. I read it again. They may also, without the word, be won by the behavior of the wife, while the husband inspects your chaste, pure conversation or behavior coupled with fear.
Near the city of São Paulo, Brazil, we find the only museum of biblical archaeology in Latin America. Founded in 2000 with 50 artifacts donated by Brazilian archaeologist Paulo Borg, the museum that bears his name has now 2,500 original artifacts, all with authenticity certificates from the countries of origin. The collection includes objects from the time of Abraham to the Middle Ages, 4,000 years of history in antiquities. Rodrigo Silva, a renowned archaeologist and theologian, is the museum's director.
These are the oldest inscriptions we have here, from 2,300 years before Christ. They are letters, receipts, treaties from the days of the patriarchs or before the time of the patriarchs.
Up until the 19th century, many scholars and scientists denied the historical existence of Babylon and the stories written in the book of Daniel. But objects like this brick found in Iraq demonstrated once again that the Bible is right.
When I did the translation, I found that there were 3 lines. The full text reads, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, supplier or principal of the temples of Izida and Asgila, firstborn of the son of Nabopolassar." I published it, and we recently checked the brick's age through thermoluminescence.
Ancient artifacts like these help us understand certain biblical stories, such as why Rachel, Jacob's wife, stole her father's idols.
By reading the Bible, many people think that it's about religion, but it isn't. What happened is that Rachel took her father's idols to give to her husband Jacob. Why? In the museum we have the answer. In Bible time, these idols, small pieces of pottery, were property certificates. When someone bought an estate from another person, he received this idol as a property certificate.
The museum offers visitors the chance to see nails, like the ones that crucified Jesus, vessels, like the one used to serve the wine at the Last Supper, letters and envelopes from the time of Abraham, a piece of rock that could have been part of the Tower of Babel, or a mirror from the time of the Apostle Paul, made of polished bronze, which helps understand better the well-known verse from the first letter to the Corinthians. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. With over 1,000 coins, it has also the largest collection of antique coins in Latin America.
This small coin is like the one the widow offered at the temple of God, and this bigger one is a silver denarius, or cycle, which Judas received for betraying Jesus Christ. Only this coin could be accepted at the temple because it was made of pure silver. So it's interesting that Judas betrayed Jesus with God's coin. I invite our viewers to discover the findings of archaeology and have the assurance that the Bible is a book that contains a true story. And this is important because if the story of the Bible is true, then the theology that is based on this story must also be true.
I've often said the spade is the Bible's best friend, in the sense that the stones archaeologically do cry out. Now, to be sure, Jesus uses that phrase in regard to the children of Jerusalem praising him on Palm Sunday, but it applies also, I think, to archaeological evidence.
Dr. Paul Meyer, professor of ancient history, conducts archaeological research as well as comparisons of sacred and secular sources from the 1st century A.D.
We find the evidence of archaeology beautifully confirms the biblical record. You don't always hear that. You rather hear some radical revisionist archaeologist coming along and say, nothing correlates. And that's wrong. The evidence is overpowering.
There's no doubt that there are critics who will claim that Jesus was not resurrected.
Blind faith can be very dangerous, especially if it's coupled with a blind obedience to an evil authority. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to emphasize, is true whether the blind faith is that of religious or secular people. But not all faith is blind faith, because faith itself carries with it the ideas of belief, trust, commitment, and is therefore only as robust as the evidence for it. I can't speak authoritatively for other religions, but faith in the Christian sense is not blind. And indeed, I do not know a serious Christian who thinks it is. Indeed, as I read it, blind faith in idols and figments of the human imagination, in other words, delusional gods, is roundly condemned in the Bible. My faith in God and Christ as the Son of God is no delusion. It is rational and evidence-based. Part of the evidence is objective. Some of it comes from science, some comes from history, and some is subjective, coming from experience.
But the evidence is all important. I mean, Einstein's predictions fit in with observed fact and with a whole body of theory, whereas we only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence.
I presume you've got faith in your wife. Is there any evidence for that?
Yes,
on which
plenty.
You base it? Yes,
plenty of evidence. Let's generalize it. Never mind about my wife. Let's generalize.
The earliest known copies of the Gospels were written on sheets of papyrus and scrolls made of animal skins. They are among the oldest existing manuscripts of antiquity. The Codex Sinaiticus was authored between AD 330 and 350. It contains almost all of the New Testament and a significant portion of the Old, while the Codex Vaticanus from the same era is a nearly complete Greek copy of the entire Bible. A papyrus fragment from the 18th chapter of John dates to AD 125, less than a single generation after the Gospel was originally written.
When I found out that we have no original survivors of the manuscripts of the New Testament, I became very skeptical. Because if all we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, then how do we know that what we possess today bears any resemblance to what the original said?
We have better manuscript attestation for the New Testament than any other ancient document. For example, the Bible of the Greeks, Homer's Iliad, is preserved in maybe 600 manuscripts, the oldest of them 1,000 years after the document was actually written. The New Testament, we have something like 5,000 Greek manuscripts. So everyone agrees, whether liberal or conservative, that we have an incredibly reliable New Testament.
We have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. We also have virtually the entire New Testament preserved in the quotations of the Church Fathers in the first 4 centuries, so that if we had no copies of the New Testament, we could reconstruct the New Testament from quotations from the early Church Fathers.
This traveling exhibit from the Israel Museum presents credible archaeological finds relating to the biblical accounts of Jesus' life and death.
Our museum director here in Fort Lauderdale has put together a marvelous exhibit that is of interest both to the Jewish and the Christian communities in our city. There are a number of exhibits that are remarkably significant to the history, the early history of Christianity, and of course to Judaism as well.
The Cradle of Christianity exhibit includes fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, significant relics of ancient Judaism and Christianity, elements of a typical Byzantine church, and several remarkable items such as the Pilate Stone.
There were a number of critics who argued that Pontius Pilate really didn't exist, that he was a literary character made up by the writers of the Gospels and then picked up by other pieces of literature. Finally, there was this stone that was discovered. It was the first physical piece of evidence that Pontius Pilate actually existed.
There is also an inscription that identifies him as being a procurator during the time of the Emperor Tiberius, which is precisely according to the chronology that we understand in the Bible.
And finally, there is now no question that Pilate really did exist. But the question that one has to ask oneself is, why would you believe a stone and not believe the Scripture?
On display next to the Pilate Stone is an ornate ossuary of the first biblical personality ever discovered.
Caiaphas was the high priest at the time that Jesus was on trial. It's significant in that Caiaphas is a major biblical character, and it's yet one more piece of evidence showing us that the New Testament writers were not playing fast and loose with the facts, that when they name a character, he's a real historical person.
Ironically, the high priest of Israel was to offer up the lamb at the Passover. Caiaphas, the high priest of Israel, offered up Christ and is actually offering him up as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
Matthew, in his gospel, he uses a metaphor of debt for sin. So it's almost as if we owed God money and we could never pay it. Our bill is so high that we could never pay it. Jesus, by his death on the cross, takes our bill and he marks it paid for us, so that the bill that we could never pay, he pays for us. Now, up until 20 or 30 years ago, there was no physical evidence of crucifixion, and there were some who questioned the nailing of a person to a cross.
Well, no one is saying that anymore, because they discovered the victim in northeast Jerusalem who had been nailed.
At this same exhibit at the museum, we have the one piece of physical evidence that we have of crucifixion, and that is an actual heel bone with the nail going through it.
It was a very punitive death, punishing death. and it was a dehumanizing death.
How horrible it must have been, not only the physical pain that Jesus Christ suffered, but the spiritual pain to be separated from his Father by taking on to himself our sin, to pay for our sin, because we could never pay for it ourselves.
The evidence of archaeology is overpoweringly in favor of biblical text.
There is a remarkable stone that comes from the Second Temple, or Herod's temple, the temple that was in Jerusalem in Jesus' day.
Josephus tells us, the first century Jewish historian, that there were 13 inscribed signs around the inner court of the temple warning any Gentile not to enter the sacred precincts, because if he did, he would be responsible for his own ensuing death.
There is that Greek inscription, which was the language of the day. As a result of Alexander the Great and the Hellenization of the world, virtually everyone had to speak Greek, regardless of what country that you lived in there in that region.
And I think it's remarkable that the evangelists and the apostles of the Lord take that language, which only appeared in the temple on a stone that forbade entry to the Gentile, and write the Gospels not in classical Hebrew but in Hellenistic Greek, and welcome the stranger and welcome the Gentile to come to Christ, who is the true temple.
Paul even uses that language in the book of Ephesians. The wall of separation has been destroyed between Jew and Gentile, between barbarian and Greek, that we are all now one in Christ Jesus. That Jesus Christ has made those who hold to his messiahship and who accept him as their Savior one, that there is no difference between us.
The impact of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection continues to break down barriers and draw the attention of both skeptics and believers.
There's no doubt that there are critics who will claim that Jesus was not resurrected. Jesus Christ was indeed resurrected, and that he did indeed change the lives of his disciples, he changed the lives of his family members, and he can change the lives of anyone else who will indeed place their trust.
According to James, some Christians' behavior is a lie against the truth, a real lie. If you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and do not lie against the truth. All right, we're talking about proving the resurrection here. James describes a condition that ought not to be in the house of God in any Christian life. He said, out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be. Does a fountain send forth at the same time, same place, sweet water and bitter? And then James makes this incredible statement. He said, this kind of duplicity or this double standard is not from above, but it's out of hell. It's devilish, he said. For where envying is, there's confusion in every evil work. Now that's a strong word coming from James. He said, if you have any ill will toward anybody.
What you see here are the retaining walls, the foundations walls of Herod the Great, and actually, in the middle, you can see an ashlar stone, typical for the time of Herod, typical for the building for the time of Herod the Great. If you know foundations from the time of Herod the Great. The archaeological remains that we found in the excavation points toward that this ground is the actual palace of Herod the Great. We have the retaining walls. It was a massive engineering project, and we see it in the excavation. We even found an enormous underground sewage that could only belong to the palace of Herod. Where exactly the sentence of Jesus took place? There are two major candidates. First is the Antonia Barracks fortress in the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount, and the other is the palace of Herod. Now, when we excavated the foundations of Herod's palace, it's made this description of the Bible more vivid. After Herod's death, a few decades longer ahead, the Roman procurator, the Roman government, probably, maybe, sat inside the palace. This was his palace, his room. So we know that Jesus was sentenced in the palace of the procurator. Okay? So maybe again, this event was here.
What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Christ?
Crucify you.
I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it.
In AD 93, the Jewish historian Josephus published his work, Antiquities of the Jews. Scholars generally agree that the following text accurately records Josephus' record of Jesus.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct to this day.
In a court of law, the rebuttal case is an opportunity for the other side to present their evidence. Well, in recent years, there's been a proliferation of books and articles about the so-called Gnostic Gospels. And I wanted to figure out, does this represent the mainstream of academic scholarship?
The Gnostic Gospels are a collection of religious writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They blend the teachings of Jesus with a variety of ancient philosophical beliefs. According to the tenets of Gnosticism, the universe was the creation of a flawed and wicked God. Therefore, all matter was evil. Salvation from this world could only be attained through secret knowledge about the spiritual nature of man.
There's been a lot of talk about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas. These documents are almost universally recognized to be much later than the New Testament Gospels and not to record historically reliable material related to Jesus.
Well, the New Testament Gospels give us a portrait of an early 1st century Palestinian Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels from the 2nd century, which are mostly Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Mary, they give us a very different Jesus. Now, you can pick and choose if you want. You can say, well, I like the 2nd century Gnostic Jesus better. Others might want the early 1st century Palestinian Jesus. But if you're going to be a scholar about it, and you're going to talk about, well, which Gospels really do give us earlier traditions that more reliably reflect the actual historical Jesus, you got to go with the New Testament Gospels every time.
There's a view among some that there were all of these different competing views of Jesus Christ, and that the one that won out became the orthodox perspective of Christ reflected in the Gospels. All the evidence runs contrary to that. Jesus was a 1st century Jewish teacher who revealed and demonstrated himself to be the Messiah. That's the presentation we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the New Testament Gospels. These later Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, present a very different Jesus, almost a Greek philosopher, an esoteric Gnostic Jesus. It's clearly not the authentic historical Jesus.
What I've come to discover is that the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are our best sources for Jesus. And I've also found that they are reliable, and that from these sources we can form a picture that I believe is very accurate, that tells us about Jesus, what he taught, how he was perceived by his contemporaries, and what his life was really all about.
More than 80 times in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is identified as the Son of Man. While the human connotations of the phrase are obvious, a broader interpretation is found in an Old Testament scripture written by the Jewish prophet Daniel.
In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Daniel 7:13.
Many Christians and non-Christians alike hear the phrase Son of Man, they think Son of God refers to his deity and Son of Man refers to his humanity. That's in part true, but in fact Son of Man has a much greater significance than that as well. The title Son of Man, Jesus draws that title from Daniel chapter 7, where a glorious messianic figure comes before the Ancient of Days, a reference to God, and he is given all glory and power and majesty. That portrait of this glorious Messiah is the one that Jesus identifies himself with. He is the Son of Man. So Son of Man doesn't just mean a human being.
His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel 7:14.
Actually, the phrase Son of Man refers to his humanness and his more than humanness. Because no human being can rule forever unless he's a forever person in some kind of way.
Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. Come. Lord, save me.
O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Of a truth, thou art the Son of God.
And so a very obvious question arises. That is Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the one sent by God to be the Savior of Israel and the world? Christians told me that there are dozens and dozens of ancient prophecies contained in the Old Testament of the Bible, and that they predict the coming of this Messiah, and that Jesus, against all mathematical odds, fulfilled those prophecies. And I thought, this is a little bit like the fingerprint evidence you see in a court of law. I remember covering one particular case where the murderer went through the purse of the victim, and he left one thumbprint on the cellophane wrapper of a package of cigarettes. And it was that thumbprint that led to his conviction for murder. And I thought, in an analogous way, could it be that these ancient prophecies are sort of like that thumbprint on the cellophane? Do they create a thumbprint that only Jesus Christ in all of history manages to match?
This is Yeshayahu 53:6 or Isaiah 53:6. Kulanu katson ta'inu, ishla darko paninu, vadonai hifnia bo, eit avon kulanu. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. I had a friend who wrote this out on a piece of paper. He typed it up on his computer without any verse notations, and he took it around to everyone in his office. He worked in a big office for a motor vehicle bureau in one of the big states in our country. And he showed it to everyone in the motor vehicle bureau and in the state capitol. And he said, just tell me who this is and where it comes from. And every single person that looked at it, Jew or Gentile alike, it didn't matter. Everyone that looked at it read it, and he said, who is this? They said, oh, it's obviously Jesus of Nazareth. That's who it is. And it's from the New Testament. And then my friend would say, but no, it's not from the New Testament. It's from the Hebrew Bible. It was written 8 centuries before Jesus came. Can you believe this? And he showed it to them from Isaiah. And people really had a hard time, because if you read this passage without any kind of presuppositions or bias, you will read it, and it will be really clear that this is the life of Yeshua. Now, could he have fabricated this, or is this just a big coincidence?
In the Old Testament, we really have two kinds of prophecies. We have prophecies that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ and prophecies that are fulfilled typologically in Christ. And I do think we need to distinguish between the two. Those that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ were once and for all fulfilled by Jesus. And those are the ones that we can really point to have apologetic value. That is to demonstrate that Jesus was the only person who could have possibly fulfilled this. His birth in Bethlehem is one of those prophecies. His role as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is one of those prophecies. His entrance into Jerusalem on a donkey from Zechariah chapter 9. These are clear evidence that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament.
The most amazing part of Isaiah's prophecies is in Isaiah 9, when it speaks about the Son of David coming to be the king, to sit on the throne of David and have an eternal righteous kingdom. And everyone knows it from Handel's Messiah. Unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given. And the idea of this verse is that the Messiah will actually be born, physically born. And then it says, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity. In other words, he's the creator, the author of time.
Some skeptics have said that Jesus could have engineered the fulfillment of these prophecies. Of course, Jesus could not have determined where he was going to be born, so to be born in Bethlehem, obviously he could not have engineered that. Also, as the suffering servant, it would have been difficult for him to engineer such a specific fulfillment of Isaiah 53. But on the other hand, the fact that Jesus performed certain actions that in fact fulfilled prophecies only demonstrates that he was indeed the Messiah. Anyone who enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey in obvious fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9 is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. So we certainly have a glimpse in that fulfilled prophecy of the self-consciousness of Jesus, that he truly believed that he was the Messiah.
Scholars have determined that Jesus fulfilled at least 4 dozen major prophecies, each written a minimum of 3 centuries before his birth. Their content ranged from specific details about his life to the symbolic implications of his death.
Psalm 22 gives a poetic picture by David, written in the first person, of what the Messiah will be like in his suffering. And one of the things he says is that they will pierce my hands and my feet. Now, David wrote before crucifixion was known, probably by about 300 years. So Isaiah 53 says he was pierced through. It gives us the reason for his death. He was pierced through for our iniquities. So there's a purpose. He dies not just because he's a martyr, but because he's a substitution for sin.
A college professor of mathematics and science named Dr. Peter Stoner wanted to determine what the odds were that any human being throughout history could fulfill the messianic prophecies. So he had his students come up with very conservative estimates of the likelihood of any human being fulfilling certain of these predictions. And then they just ran the numbers. And what they determined is that the odds of any human being fulfilling 48 of these ancient prophecies would be 1 chance in a trillion. This was not just an intellectual journey. There was a very real emotional component to this, because I would find things along the way that would challenge me and my worldview on a very deep level. and I would recoil from it, and I wouldn't want to believe it, and I mean, there were so many reasons why I didn't want there to be a God, because I did not want to be held accountable for my life.
I didn't know it
down the street and met with him. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
For more than a year, I'd investigated the historical record for the reliability of the New Testament. I'd looked at the identity of Jesus. But now was time to look at the ultimate evidence for who he really was, the purported resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And for that, I went to the best scholars that I could track down.
William Lane Craig, Biola University. Gary Habermas, Liberty University. Michael Licona, North American Mission Board.
He claimed to be the uniquely divine servant of God, and he claimed that the only way that we could get to God would be through him. Now, I submit to you that if one of your professors made some claims like that, you would think that he or she was a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. Those are some really audacious claims. Well, a lot of Jesus critics responded to him the same way that you or I would respond to someone making those claims today. Oh yeah, pal? You really think that's who you are? Well, tell you what, why don't you show it to us? Why don't you give us a sign? Show us a miracle or something. And Jesus said, well, I'll give you one miracle, one sign, my resurrection from the dead.
The resurrection of Jesus really is the pivotal event of history. Anybody can claim to be the Son of God, as Jesus clearly did. The question is, can you back it up? What evidence is there to support your claim? What credentials do you have? And if Jesus really did return from the dead, that's excellent evidence that he is who he claimed to be, the one and only Son of God.
To weigh the validity of Jesus' resurrection, we must first consider his death. Many skeptics have proposed that Jesus merely fainted on the cross, or was drugged, and later escaped as part of a conspiracy. By contrast, the four gospel narratives collectively describe the events of his public beating, death by crucifixion, and burial.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
Chances of surviving crucifixion were extremely bleak. Crucifixion and the tortures that normally preceded it was the worst way to die in antiquity. A person was scourged to the point usually that their intestines, arteries, and veins were laid bare. And then after that, a person was dragged out where they were impaled to a cross or a tree and then left hanging there in excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from the Latin, out of the cross.
Jesus was being tried and executed as a rebel leader. Now, in the Roman army, if you were responsible for looking after one prisoner of war, even if he was a rather insignificant prisoner of war, if you let him get away, your life would be forfeit in place of his, and life was very cheap. If you were looking after the execution of a rebel leader and you let him get away, you're in deep trouble. You're not going back home to your wife and kids. No way. Game over. The Romans were very, very good at killing people. They specialized in it. They prided themselves on it.
Perhaps the most definitive statement of Jesus' death at the hands of the Romans is recorded in the Gospel of John.
One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John 19:34.
Medical experts have concluded that this account from John, an eyewitness of the crucifixion, is evidence that as he suffocated on the cross, Jesus' heart had ruptured.
Yeah, I believe that Christ's suffering and the demonstration of the kind of physiologic stress that his human body was under is manifested in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it's described that he was sweating blood. And there is a well-documented medical condition in which patients who are under tremendous amount of emotional stress and physiological stress can in fact sweat blood because little blood vessels within the glands burst, and then the blood is expressed. The scourge involved the use of a short whip with pieces of typically metal, sometimes bone, sometimes pieces of porcelain wrapped in these leather straps, which is then utilized to come across typically the back, the shoulders, the legs of the victim. The first few passes across a particular body part would tear through the skin, the fat, but eventually, once the outer layers were torn away, it would start getting in the muscle and the tendon. And of course, along the way, you're ripping through all the blood vessels that supply all those tissues. And so you're losing blood the whole time. The plant that was described actually had a very long thorn, not the little thorns that we would think from a rose bush. These were thorns that were typically 1.5 inches to 2 inches in length. The scalp is one of the most vascular portions of our bodies. It had a huge blood supply up there. So then having those thorns shoved down into down onto the bony plate would have gone through all the scalp, which in and of itself would have created a huge amount of blood loss. I've seen people actually bleed to death from just a scalp injury. So it's not a small injury to have, who knows, dozens of these things shoved into your scalp. And so that would have caused more blood loss. Typically, when a victim has to carry the cross, what has been described in the literature, in actual Roman literature, is they describe they carry the crossbar, and the crossbar is estimated alone was estimated to weigh about 110 pounds. And of course, if your arms are stuck out here, wrapped up on the crossbar, and you fall down, you need help getting up. You just can't get up on your own because there's no possible way without your arms to get up. So he would have needed help getting up. If he fell over, there's a good chance that he could have hit his chest, which then could account for the possibility of a cardiac injury. Anatomically, we consider the wrists as part of the hand, and so with the placement of the nails between the radius and the ulna, at that position, it still fits the definition of being in the hand, and it's in a position in which the nail won't rip out, which you have to have a solid point of fixation. Another interesting point about the placement of that is the median nerve goes right straight through that particular portion of the wrist, and so there would have been either destruction of the nerve or impingement of the nerve that would have created a tremendous amount of pain, so that every time you try to take a breath, it'd be agonizing. You'd be pushing down on spiked feet, which of course hurt, and then you'd be hanging on spiked arms. And so you alternate from excruciating pain to excruciating pain every time you take a breath. So even if he survives the actual crucifixion, he would have had to survive what I believe to be a lethal injury from the spear to find out whether he was alive or not. What's described is the loss of water and blood, and that would entail either either a pleural effusion or pericardial effusion, and the blood would have come from either pulmonary artery, a pulmonary vein, the aorta or vena cava, or the heart itself. None of those injuries, unless you're treated immediately by a trauma surgeon like myself, with all the advanced equipment that we have, would be survivable after even a few minutes. Christ, as the Son of God, could have survived anything. He chose to manifest himself as a human at that point in time and allowed himself to die. And being human at that point in time, he could not have survived this particular series of traumas. It's not possible. Christ as God could have survived anything they threw at him. But he chose to be Christ, the human, at that point in time to die for our sins. And that given that self-limitation of remaining to be human, he died. He did not survive the event. I'm profoundly impacted by it. because I realized the price that he paid was something I would never be willing to do for probably anybody. It's very difficult for me to even sing songs about the cross, even in worship, because I truly do understand what he paid, the price that he paid.
There came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. Matthew 27:57-60.
All four Gospels tell us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. That's a remarkable statement, and certainly a historical statement. The evidence for that is, first of all, Joseph of Arimathea is identified as a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, that condemned Jesus.
The presence of Joseph of Arimathea in the empty tomb narrative indicates that this is a historically reliable account of what really happened. His name would have been known to people in those days very much like a United States senator would be known today. It would have been very clear where his tomb was, so that there would have been no question about the location of Jesus' burial. It also, I think, indicates that the burial account of Jesus could not have been made up.
It is highly unusual to find that the person who alone has the courage to go to Pilate and give Jesus an honorable burial is not members of his family, faithful disciples who followed him to the end. Instead, it is a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very high court, all of whom, Mark says, had condemned Jesus of Nazareth to the cross. The fact that it is Joseph of Arimathea who is the person responsible for giving Jesus an honorable burial is an awkward and embarrassing fact for the early church, and yet this tradition is faithfully preserved in almost all of the traditions that we have about the burial of Jesus.
If Jesus really was killed by the Romans, if his body really was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, then the next focus of my investigation became obvious. On the first Sunday after the crucifixion, was the tomb of Jesus Christ really empty?
On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Luke 24:1.
The empty tomb story also has a very embarrassing feature of it that is preserved in the memory of the early church, namely the discovery of the empty tomb by women. Now, in order to appreciate this, you have to understand something of the status of women in Palestinian Jewish society. In that society, which was a patriarchal society, women were frankly second-class citizens.
If you were going to invent an account about an empty tomb, then why on earth would you invent witnesses, primary witnesses, whom no one would believe? In fact, they would scoff at that later on.
Supposing you were inventing the story of the resurrection of Jesus, many people have said, oh, this was all just dreamed up later on. Well, how would you have done that? The one thing you wouldn't have done would have been to have not only a woman, but a woman who's got nobody quite knows what, but a fairly shady past, as your prime witness. And yet there she is, Mary Magdalene, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and particularly in John. And already by the middle of the 2nd century, the pagans are sneering, oh, this is just based on the testimony of hysterical women, you can't believe that. But the early Christians stuck to their story, they stuck to their guns, they stuck to the women. They said this is how it was. Now, they just would never have made that up. And that actually has enormous ramifications. If this is how the story was, and they didn't change it to airbrush Mary out, then this really must have been what happened.
Acknowledged that the tomb was empty. If you've got a stolen body, you must have an empty tomb. If the tomb was not empty, Jesus' opponents would surely have gone and got the body and shown it as soon as the disciples began proclaiming the resurrection.
I found the evidence for the empty tomb very convincing, but you know what? That didn't tell me what happened to Jesus. Is it true that hundreds of people really saw him alive after the crucifixion? My research took me to a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and it contains the earliest passage of all about what happened to the resurrected Jesus.
He was raised on the third day. He appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me. 1 Corinthians 15, 4-8.
Paul, who is a first-generation Christian, having met and seen the resurrected Jesus, describes resurrection appearances to Peter, to the apostles, to James, and finally to himself. And he also mentions 500 people who saw Jesus alive. So we have eyewitness first-hand account of someone who himself saw Jesus alive and knows of 500 people or so who saw Jesus alive. That's extraordinarily strong evidence.
These people, Paul tells us, were still alive at the time that he was telling the Corinthians about it. And his implication is we have hundreds of people who actually saw Jesus risen from the dead. If you don't believe me, you can ask them about it because they're still alive.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells the Corinthian church that he passed on what he received. He uses the language, actually, of a formal transfer of tradition. What he received, and then he describes the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection appearances. This confirms for us that the accounts of the resurrection were creedal tradition that were passed on to Paul. So if 1 Corinthians was written in the early to mid-50s of the first century, these traditions were much earlier than that, going back to the period of Paul's conversion in the 30s. So that pushes the accounts of the resurrection to a very, very early date.
Deep in the heart of the Judean wilderness, the edge of the Dead Sea, in a place called Qumran, came some of the most significant artifacts of modern times, the Dead Sea Scrolls. For 2 millennia, the Dead Sea Scrolls lay hidden in 11 caves throughout the Qumran area. Their discovery marked the biggest archaeological find of the 20th century. To learn more, we hiked up to one of those 11 caves with Stephen Fawn, founder of the University of the Holy Land and an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And why are they so important to us today?
The reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are important is because they confirm the Bible that we have. There's variants, but basically you can hardly tell the difference between the two texts that we have in Qumran and in our own Bibles.
The scrolls provide a 2,000-year-old link between the scriptures during the time of Jesus and today.
Because we can actually hold the same scrolls in our hands that they held in their hands 2,000 years ago. And when somebody sits there with their New Testament and their Bibles in the United States and they're listening to their favorite sermon, they can know that this Bible was based upon manuscripts that people held in their hands from 2,000 years ago.
Now, for the first time since 1967, the original scroll of Isaiah, perhaps the most significant part of the entire discovery, is on display at the Israel Museum.
Well, here in Jerusalem, there's the aptly named Shrine of the Book, where some of the most precious religious writings are on display. But even in these special and carefully climate-controlled conditions, some of the older texts are in danger of being lost to us forever.
The most famous documents displayed here are the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of biblical texts and religious writings from the time of Christ. The scrolls lay hidden for nearly 2 millennia until a Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon them in 1946.
They are believed to be the discovery of the 20th century. We're talking about a corpus of over 900 manuscripts, comprising all of the books of the Bible.
Right.
And these are the oldest copies of the Bible that we have, 2,000 years old.
Wow.
We have
These ancient texts are so fragile that only 4 highly trained researchers from the Israel Antiquities Authority are allowed actually to handle them.
What Len is going to show you now is a sample of the book of Psalms, and this is one of what we call.
Oh goodness! Now that's the
big
real
scrolls.
thing, isn't it?
Yes, you're looking at it upside down, but this is.
It might as well be upside down to me, but if you want to turn it around the right way.
Okay. We have about 6 such plates.
Yes.
Okay, 6 such pieces. Again, we keep them as they were found. And if you look closely here, even if you can't read Hebrew, every place the name of God is written, exactly, the Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, it is written in what we call Paleo-Hebrew, which is Hebrew of First Temple times.
So an ancient Hebrew, an older Hebrew.
An older Hebrew.
And that's God, 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 God. So you see every time, and there's quite a lot of him, obviously.
Yes.
He features quite highly.
You're right. Please don't touch.
Oh, sorry, I was touching the glass, wasn't I? Sorry.
Yes.
These documents are so precious that even touching the glass is forbidden. And the next scroll is all about rules and regulations. It's the 10 Commandments.
This is the only copy that contains all of the 10 Commandments.
Oh my goodness! So this is is this the oldest record of the 10 Commandments?
This is the oldest record of the 10 Commandments. Lennon, I want to show them.
Wow! Amazing. Amazing. So that alone of all, it would be the most a priceless document, isn't it? Amazing.
And every child or every grown-up will, when you say the 10 Commandments,
is familiar with
knows
them, exactly.
what you're talking about.
And breaks one of them every day.
And breaks one of them every day. And these are 2,000 years old.
Paul seems to think that the best argument for this text is that he received it from trustworthy persons. I gave you what I was given. The answer's right. I went to the right people. And critics believe that Paul got this material. Generally, they say he received it in Jerusalem about 35 AD.
First of all, he's early. He's writing within 20 to 35 years of the purported event itself, because he's quoting from a creed, an oral formula, tradition that predates the writing of the New Testament, for which most scholars date to between 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself.
1 Corinthians 15:3-7 provides evidence that belief in the resurrection was already present among Jews within 2 to 3 years after Jesus was killed. That means that the resurrection stories aren't something that evolved over 30, 40, 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus.
Behold the multitude. This is a desert place, and now the time's far past. Send them away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves bread. They have nothing to eat.
Give ye them to eat. Shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? How many loaves have ye?
5 and 2 fishes.
Bring them to me. Divide the people into companies of 50 that they might be fed. O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, I thank thee for thy bounties. Amen.
something special, but they wondered if they were mistaken when he died. They didn't anticipate that. Suffer maybe, but die at the hands of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor? In fact, even when the first reports of his resurrection reached their ears, they were still doubtful and skeptical. But when they met the risen Lord, their skepticism was transformed into a very confident faith, a great joy, and a determination to preach the good news to everyone else. And I think that's the part that's awfully hard to refute, because we have this turnabout, this transformation of a discouraged and bewildered following on the basis of the good news.
Somehow you have to explain the explosion from scared followers who run away to let's worship him, let's sing to him, let's pray to him.
If there was no resurrection, and more to the point, if there was no resurrection appearances of Jesus, to those who doubted and were discouraged and denied and betrayed Jesus, we would not be sitting here talking about this today.
Other messianic figures had risen in the past, had claimed to be somebody, and had been suppressed and killed by the Romans. Yet no movement arose around those dead messiahs. But these disciples of Jesus were willing to go to the ends of the earth proclaiming the gospel message. Were willing to suffer and die for that. The transformation from a bunch of defeated cowards to boldly, fearlessly proclaiming the gospel, even to the point of death, to me confirms that something happened on that first Easter morning.
I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 2 Corinthians 11:23.
After Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples lived lives of hardship for 20, 30, 40 years, suffered greatly in their ministries, and eventually suffered martyrdom and execution without recanting for their belief that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead.
I mean, what were they gaining? Were they becoming rich? They're running around the countryside. They're, in some cases, abandoning their family for periods of time so they can preach. What they got for their efforts is death, in many cases.
You also have to remember that the disciples died not just for something they believed was true. They died for something they actually saw with their own eyes. It's much more difficult to explain that away than it is for someone who dies for a belief and they're sincerely wrong.
Archaeologists may have found lost city of Jesus' apostles. Experts believe they have found the lost Roman city of Julius, formerly the village of Bethsaida, which was the home of Jesus' apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Last month, archaeologists from the Kinneret Institute for Galilean Archaeology at Kinneret College, Israel and Nyack College in New York, completed excavations at El Araj on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. El Araj has long been considered a possible location of ancient Julius, which was also known as Bethsaida. There are indications that re-excavating Bethsaida Julia we have to continue digging to confirm and clarify, Stephen Notley of Nyack College, the DIGS academic director, told Fox News. This is really one of the few biblical sites that has remained lost. The Roman city of Julius was born out of the Jewish fishing village of Bethsaida during the 1st century AD, according to the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. The New Testament describes Bethsaida as the home of Jesus' apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Jesus also healed a blind man at Bethsaida, according to Mark 8:22-26, while Luke 9:10-17 describes a nearby location for the feeding of the 5,000 people.
Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And you know, that's my story. It was someone who said, I'm going to investigate this stuff with an open mind, let it take me wherever the evidence will take me. And what I discovered in the end is Jesus made the claim that he is the truth, that everything hinges on his identity. In fact, everything hinges on the resurrection. because anybody can claim to be the Son of God. If Jesus really did return from the dead, then he is who he claimed to be, and that changes everything. But what about your own journey? I'd really encourage you, if you've never done it, to investigate the evidence for yourself, but make 3 resolutions up front. Number 1, make it a front burner issue in your life. Number 2, resolve to have an open mind, to go wherever the evidence takes you, even if it takes you to the very uncomfortable conclusion that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And then finally, resolve that once the evidence is in, you will reach a verdict in the case for Christ.
Righteous Father, I have declared unto them thy name, and will declare it, that thy love, wherewith thou hast loved me, may be in them, and I in them. Go ye therefore, and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world.
He is more than you could ever need. He's more than the eye could see. I don't deserve his love, but he's always been there for me. You see, Jesus met me when I was at my lowest. And if you don't know Jesus, know this. He is the greatest example of generosity this world of greed has ever seen. And when Jesus hit the scene, he changed the scenery and met diversity with serenity. If you're looking for peace, he offers plenty. Jesus was and Jesus will forever be king. And when the angels sing, they sing of the grace that was displayed for sinners like me. I can't explain him and I can't describe him. And if I could, he wouldn't be Jesus, because you can't explain eternity and you can't comprehend the galaxies. But it was the loving hands of Jesus who spun them into existence and created man, knowing he would go to the cross to pay our sentence. There was a certificate of judgment with a period after the sentence, and we were sentenced to death long before he said it is finished. He is a father to the orphan, a shelter for the homeless, a hiding place for the abused, and an anchor for our storms. He stormed the gates of hell and came out on top, and the power of his gospel cannot be stopped, even when the world tries. They try a lot. He traded places with Barabbas and became the catalyst of missions across the world, covering every portion of the atlas. If you're in need of rest, I know of a mattress. If you don't know Jesus, your future is tragic, but he gladly embraced tragedy so we could live in his presence of majesty. His presence is presence, and it's his presence that presents preciousness to a world of peasants. He is far from pretentious, but still loves those who are. He is the light of the world and hung the stars. He brings the dead to life and delivers life to the dead. He took a crown of thorns on his head so we could put crowns at his feet, and I can't wait until I get to kiss his feet that were nailed to a cross for me and for you and for every person around the world. He loves the world, and I love his word, because the word became flesh, and in his flesh he demonstrated the word to the world. He is an example to every boy and every girl. He is a lover of black people. He is a lover of white people. He is a lover of the unchurched and the assembly under the steeple. He doesn't see the believers' failures, but still takes time to celebrate their faithfulness. It's the power of the Spirit that enables us and gives us boldness when the world labels us. And if you want to label me, please call me a Jesus freak. If that freaks you out, good. Because it's better to be good with God than to fight being misunderstood by a world that could never understand. So let it be understood that I don't worship man, we worship Jesus. And although he doesn't need us, he still sees us and pleads with us to run to the cross where he bled for us. His heart bleeds for us, his heart grieves for us, but still graciously grants us a pardon for our treason in a season where the world tries to explain away the work of the Spirit with human reasoning. There's a reason they can't. Because the Spirit is like the wind, and the wind cannot be seen. But loved is the one who believes without seeing the unseen. I'm telling you today that Jesus is something. He's something more. He's something great. And if you want to know him, you don't have to wait. He stands at the narrow path with a key to the gate, and you only have to reach out and embrace his grace. I don't care who's president. I have a king who is always present. I don't care who holds musical celebrity. The voice of the Lord will always be the sweetest melody. I don't care who owns the riches of the globe. My Jesus holds more wealth than one ruby on his robe. I don't care who is the strongest or the fastest. Nothing matches the creator of the universe and his immortal, infinite status. I don't care about religious leaders who died and stayed dead. I'll only worship the one who conquered death and wears a crown on his head. His name is Jesus, and I'm telling you, he's something. He was faithful yesterday, and he is faithful today. I can feel his presence whenever I pray, and when the time comes for me to fade away, I'll remember the day I heard him say, "My name is Jesus."